This is episode 692 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Matthew Mitchell. He is senior fellow in the Center for Human Freedom at the Fraser Institute, a Canadian free market think tank. But more importantly, Matt is a fellow New Mexican. He once upon a time worked with the Rio Grande Foundation. Now he lives in Angel Fire, New Mexico, and does his work for the Fraser Institute from there. And we've got a very, very exciting report, Economic Freedom in the Land of Enchantment, that he and I have co-written, which is really, I think, probably the single best summary of New Mexico and its problems economically based on its lack of economic freedom. And so we're going to dive into that report today. But welcome, Matt, to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. It's great to see you.
Yeah, no, it's great to talk to you. And it's been fun, I guess. It may be a strong word, but it's certainly been exciting to work on this project with you and highlight, I think, the failings, the challenges that New Mexico has when it comes to economic freedom. And of course, we've had your colleague, mostly Dean Stansel at the Fraser Institute, or SMU. I don't know what body he works for it. I forget, but there's so many different moving parts with these reports and different collaborations going on. We've talked to Dean about the Economic Freedom Index of North America, and you can go back if you want and listen to those shows and go find the Economic Freedom in North America. Fraser Institute does Economic Freedom of the World, which begs the question as we get this particular show started, what is economic freedom, and how does it play into every aspect of our lives?
Yeah. So the way I think of economic freedom is it's really a subset of human freedom. And human freedom is the idea that you are allowed to do what you want, so long as you don't harm or invade the rights of others. And so a couple of things I want to point out with this. So when you talk about allowed, we're not talking about ability. I don't have the ability to dunk on a regulation, basketball hoop. I don't have the ability to buy a yacht. But I am allowed to. If I have the means and I want to do it, nobody can stop me. So that's an important distinction. And then the other thing I would point out is that it's really, while you can think of it in sort of like black and white terms, I think it's more accurate to think of it in terms of a spectrum. You can be allowed to do more or less with your time and with your resources. So the government might, for example, allow you to start a business that is, selling, tacos into Mexico, but it might not allow you to grow wheat on your own farm and use it for your own consumption, which there's a federal, there's a famous Supreme Court case that
Wickard v. Filburn, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's a spectrum. It can allow you to do more things or fewer things, and it can allow you to, it can have more punishments for when it's prohibiting certain behavior or fewer punishments. So that's sort of, overall human freedom. And then we can just think of economic freedom as a subset of this, which has to do with you have greater economic freedom when you are allowed to make more of your own economic decisions, not necessarily overall decisions. So this has to do with your ability to buy and to sell and to contract with others, your ability to, start a business and run it the way you want. So the interesting thing is there's kind of an ambiguous relationship between government and freedom overall, as well as government and economic freedom. So government can enable you to be allowed to make more of your own choices by protecting your property, by enforcing any contracts that you engage in, protecting your person. However, it can also limit your ability sorry, I shouldn't say ability, limit what you're allowed to do by restricting choice through regulations or taxes or manipulation of the value of money, limitations on your ability to trade, those types of things. So it has a little bit of an ambiguous relationship here, but the basic premise is people have more economic freedom when they are allowed to make more of their own economic choices.
Yeah. Now, briefly run through those products that you have worked on one way or the other, maybe not you personally, but organizationally, because uh, this is not just idle talk. Your
Yeah.
organization, the Fraser Institute, has studied economic freedom for decades and produced reports highlighting economic freedom. But this is a unique report. But talk about some of those other reports, and I've talked to your colleagues as well. Just talk about the history of these kind of reports more broadly, and what can people find about economic freedom from the Fraser Institute.
Sure. So, the history goes way, way back, way before even Adam Smith. There were scholastic scholars in the University of Salamanca in Spain, and there was Chinese philosophers. Lao Tzu was talking about this stuff. So for hundreds of years, for centuries, economists have been making the case for freedom overall, as well as for economic freedom. But for much of that time, for most of that time, we had no way of evaluating these arguments. They were sort of blackboard arguments that made a lot of sense to a lot of people, but there was no real way to test them. And so the idea of actually testing it came out of the 1980s. Interestingly enough, it was 1984, and there was a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, and it was in England. And being 1984, they were debating George Orwell's book, 1984. And they were talking about, what's the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom or civil liberties? When places grant their citizens more economic freedom, do they also tend to grant them more political freedom, or vice versa? And it was an interesting debate. There was the historian, famous historian Paul Johnson was there. But unfortunately, it kind of ended with people throwing up their hands and saying, unfortunately, all we can do is debate. We have no way of testing these things. So after this session, the founder of the Fraser Institute, a man named Michael Walker, he had been an economist, or is an economist, and he sat down for lunch with Milton and Rose Friedman. And he said, what if we measure it? And Milton and Rose said, what? And he said, yeah, what if we figure out a way to measure economic freedom? And as I've heard the story, I think Milton at first kind of thought this was a harebrained idea, but Rose was the one who said, maybe you're onto something. And as usually happened, apparently with the Friedmans, once Rose had convinced herself, she managed to convince her husband. And so Mike Walker and the Friedmans really launched this effort to try to measure economic freedom. And the way they did it is they started really, I think really strategically. They went out and raised money to hold a series of conferences over quite a long period of time. They involved about over 60 economists, including 3 Nobel laureates, very famous economists. Even the ones who weren't Nobel laureates were quite famous. And over about a decade, they started to develop this framework and this methodology for measuring economic freedom. And the basic idea is they looked at go back to the definition, they looked at public policies that either enable or stand in the way of people making their own economic choices. So they looked at things like the manipulation of the money supply, taxes and regulations and barriers to international trade. And then they also looked at things like rule of law and protection of persons and property. So the first index was published in the mid 90s. The authors were Jim Gwartney, Bob Lawson, and they ended up producing this index over, basically every year. And now we have this very large database going back to the 1970s, measuring economic freedom in 165 countries around the world. And what's kind of exciting about it is that, they put this product out there that is, I think, valuable in and of its own right. However, economists that not affiliated with Fraser, just academics around the world, have taken this up and started to use it. So the index has been cited, something like 14,000 times in Google Scholar, but it's been used by academic economists in over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies. So they take it and they use this as a predictor of things like per capita GDP and growth in GDP, happiness, immigration, lifespan, health, just you name it. Economists have used this index to study it. And the overwhelming evidence is that economic freedom seems to be associated with things that are good, that people care about. Higher incomes, longer life, higher incomes for the poorest among us, lower poverty rates. And it seems to be negatively correlated with things that people don't like. So with more economic freedom, countries seem to have less corruption. They have greater tolerance, less discrimination. So all these, these factors have been studied, and it's really just this kind of remarkable intellectual enterprise, because it's going back to, I mentioned, at the beginning, I started with Adam Smith, and here we are several hundred years later, and you can empirically test Adam Smith's main propositions, and lo and behold, they actually are quite well supported by the data.
So you've got an international report and a report of the states and North America. So you have Canadian provinces and even Mexican states in that report, although I don't think you've done Mexican states for that many years. That took a long time to get that data available, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So after the economic freedom of the world had been out for a while, I think it's now about, so that started 30 years ago. And then about 20 years ago, Fraser started publishing the economic freedom in North America. And in its current iteration, you're absolutely right. It's the 10 Canadian provinces, 50 US states, 32 Mexican states, and we have Puerto Rico. And so we partner with a Mexican think tank to produce the Mexican data. And here we try to get, it's hard to stitch these three different countries' data from these three different countries together, but as best we can, we try to get an apples to apples comparison of all of these subnational indices across North America. It also has a subnational index. So we also have a measure that just looks at the 50 US states, not trying to compare to Mexico and Canada. And that kind of is probably the one I would recommend people use if they're trying to understand how New Mexico's economic freedom relates to that of other US states.
All right. So this report is, I believe, the first that you and obviously but you and anyone else from Fraser Institute's the first one that Fraser Institute's published along with a state think tank in the relevant state. Of course, you being here in Angel Fire, native New Mexican, familiar with New Mexico, probably didn't hurt to make this the maiden voyage, but it's something that I'm very pleased to be a part of and proud of. And in many ways, after now 19 years, I started March 1st of 2006 at the Rio Grande Foundation. This is as comprehensive and really, I think, detailed and explanatory of a report as has ever been published about New Mexico, its economic challenges, many of them being self-imposed, but why New Mexico fails to keep pace with other US states, especially our neighboring states. So you're the one that came up with the kind of the concept and said, are you interested in doing this, Paul? And I jumped all over it. So what was the impetus behind this project, and what else do you want to share about it?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, this is something you and I have talked about, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners think about this a lot. You grow up in this state and you can't help but love it. It is an absolutely physically gorgeous state. The culture is so rich. The people are so interesting. They're so kind and welcoming. The food is, spectacular. And yet, for all of these advantages, and I say this, like I always mention to people, like there's more golfing days in New Mexico than there are in Phoenix. Easily, because Phoenix is just so ungodly hot, and you can golf, you can ski in the morning and golf in the afternoon. How many places have that kind of environment? And then you can go see tour a cultural site the next day. It's got all of this really, really good elements. But yet it's still just lags behind its neighbors. And so even as a kid growing up, I would visit other states, and just be amazed at the relative prosperity of these other states. And we talk to adults, and they say, well, we have a poor state. It's one of the lowest income states in the country, and that's just the kind of the way it is. And I feel like it doesn't have to be that way. And so one of the things we wanted to do here is to better understand, how long we know we have this measure of economic freedom in the state, and we know it's relatively low, but how long has that been the case? What's happened over time. And as we dug into the data, it was a little bit worse than I thought, to be honest. I knew it was one of the least free states. What I had no idea is we gathered this data looking at the change in economic freedom in all 50 states over the time period for which we have data, and it goes back to the early 80s. And there was one state in the union that lost economic freedom over that more than 40 plus year period, and it's New Mexico. It's like, what is going on here that this state, which has so much going for it, just can't get its act together in terms of its institutions and the degree of economic freedom it permits its citizens.
Yeah, just to be clear, what you're saying is that New Mexico is the only state in the union to have lost economic freedom under your report, the way you measure things, dating back to 1981. So that is quite an achievement, so to speak. What are we talking about, though? Of course, we're talking relative because we're talking about comparing New Mexico to all the other states. How does your reporting account for economic freedom? What are the big variables? You don't need to go into depth on all of them, just kind of run through some of the
Sure,
big,
sure.
most
So
impactful.
the biggest things it's looking at are spending, taxes, and the degree of labor regulations. So in some ways, actually, it probably misses some of the really relevant taxes in the state, because New Mexico has severance taxes, and that's one of the few taxes that we don't include in our index because it's an unusual tax across states. But basically, we're looking at the degree to which people are allowed to make their own decisions. And so it's got, I think, 10 variables that account for that. And so it's looking at things like, general consumption expenditures by the government as a percentage of income. It's looking at transfers and subsidies. It's looking at insurance and retirement payments as a percent of income. It's looking at income and payroll tax revenue, as well as corporate income tax revenue. It's looking at top marginal tax rates, sales tax revenue, that type of thing. It's basically trying to assess as objectively as we can the degree to which government is inhibiting people's ability to exchange with one another.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the, we'll describe in some detail some of the charts and information that highlight not necessarily the economic freedom or lack thereof, but the impacts of our lack of economic freedom. So the report includes New Mexico, Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, and Utah, and then an average of the Southwest states. And overwhelmingly, New Mexico winds up falling relative to these other states. For example, population growth in the Southwest. We're at 1%. The next lowest state's 4%, Oklahoma. This is 2013 to 2022. 11% in Colorado, 12% in Arizona, 14% Texas, 16% in Utah, 12% the average of the southwestern states. I mean, employment growth, income growth, real GDP growth, so your economy, and then poverty, children receiving food assistance in the Southwest. All of these, New Mexico, it does not do particularly well, and generally is either at the top or the bottom. And we always say, and I'm sure you're aware of this, New Mexico can reliably be found at the top of the bad lists and the bottom of the good lists. And those would all indicate that. And you're pointing the finger, as do we, at economic freedom or our lack of economic freedom.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think one of the things to do to just get a handle on things is to start there with, okay, what is the state of New Mexico's economy and its people based on these factors relative to its neighbors, and then take a step back and look at these exact same variables and see what's their relationship to economic freedom. So you just gave some numbers there on the state relative to its neighbors. Let me give you a few numbers. If you look at all states, but you divide them up into quartiles. So the bottom 25% in terms of economic freedom, the third, second, and then the most economically free states. So in terms of population, so you mentioned that New Mexico's population growth is anemic, especially relative to the Southwest. Well, that's really not at all out of character with what you find for states that lack economic freedom, like New Mexico. So if you compare the freest states with the least free, like New Mexico, the freest states, their populations have grown over that same time period, that last decade, 10 times faster than the least free. If you look at total employment in the freest states has grown 3 times faster than relative to the least free. If you look at change in total income, so over that last decade in the freest states, total income, so you're adding up the entire population and its income, it grew 25%, whereas in the least free, it's only grown 17%. Change in real GDP, it's grown 24% in the freest states, where it's 14% in the least free. And then the reverse is true again with all the bad stuff. So poverty tends to be higher in the least free states. Children receiving food assistance tends to be higher in the least free states. So the specific problem that you're seeing in New Mexico, from an economic perspective, it's not particularly surprising. It is very consistent with the trends that we see overall. It's almost like saying, okay, I found a person who has a ton of health problems. And yeah, it turns out that they smoke and they don't and they drink too much and they don't get any exercise and they eat poorly. And then so you take a step back and you say, okay, well that's relatively consistent with what the empirical findings say about what is a contributing factor to health, to poor health. Which isn't to say that there might be other causes, but this is what you can affect. So we find, for example, economists do find that luck plays a role in growth and geography plays a role in growth. There's other things, climate plays a role in growth, but you can't move policymakers can't move mountains. They can't create luck. What they can do is create institutions that are conducive to economic activity. And in New Mexico, they've created institutions that are not conducive to economic activity with very high taxes, high spending, and relatively high regulations.
Yeah. So let's talk a little turkey about what New Mexico does and doesn't do in some of these areas. So one of the unique things about New Mexico, and we've highlighted just the way the data works, is that our spending and tax burdens do not line up. Can you briefly explain why that is?
Yeah, so essentially New Mexico benefits from quite a bit of federal government largesse, right? In a number of ways, we've got a lot of federal government activities in the state, from the labs to the military bases, to also there's quite a bit of redistribution. So we're what's known essentially as a net receiver, a net beneficiary of federal government money. And so what that means is while we score relatively low in terms of the economic freedom from spending, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around because we measure spending as a share of the economy or share of income. And so the higher the spending, the lower the economic freedom. So we score 49th out of 50 states in terms of government spending, which means that we have quite a bit of government spending. On taxes, we score better. It's still in the bottom half. We still score 36th in the country out of 50. But the reason for that is that we're able to benefit from quite a bit of federal spending. We also have another huge thing that we can benefit from, and you know this better than I, and could probably speak to this better than I. But we make a lot of money. The state government makes a lot of money from the severance taxes, and so that has sort of permitted the state to spend well beyond what other states spend without having to necessarily tax its citizens as much as other states do.
Yeah. Um, so based on the numbers and the data in our report, I know we're getting into dicey territory, but if you had any recommendations for New Mexico policymakers, uh, based on our findings here, what would you recommend they look at? Obviously, we're getting to the end of the legislative session here. It's not going to happen this time around. And given our political leadership, I'm not optimistic that anything significant relating to economic freedom will be adopted, even though we're sitting on piles and piles of cash in the state treasury. But um, give me a point or two about what you see based on just this report, where New Mexico policymakers should be looking to go.
So, I'd almost end with the beginning is we should be looking at our neighbors and seeing what they do. Texas has no income tax. All of our neighbors have lower tax rates. We have the gross receipts tax. There's some things actually that economists tend to like about the gross receipts tax, I should say, by the way. It's nice that it's a relatively broad-based tax. Um, but with few exemptions. But if you have that tax, that's great, but then you shouldn't have an income tax, right? It shouldn't be you shouldn't be double taxing all this income. So lowering tax rates, lowering spending. There's a number of regulatory reforms. So, New Mexico's minimum wage is the second highest in the union. Relative to median income. And what that essentially means is that people are not allowed to engage in exchange that they want to. Minimum wage has been well studied. There's quite a bit of evidence that a high minimum wage, if it's above the market equilibrium, tends to lead to unemployment among young and unskilled workers. And the reason for that is that if you should be able to negotiate with your boss and say, I always tell my students, like when I got my first job at 17, I really could not claim to be creating a lot of revenue for the company. And so it would have been ludicrous for me to negotiate for an extremely high wage because it's just not worth it. And those jobs where people are first starting out are really, really important in terms of gaining skill sets, and in terms of building a resume and working their way up. But New Mexico, blunts that very beginning of people's careers by pricing them out of the market with a very high minimum wage. There's some other measures that we actually don't include in the report, but I think are really important, like barriers to entry and occupational licensure. There's quite a bit that the state could do there, even though the state has actually made some recent progress on that end. Land use regulations are another one that I think the state we're slightly above the national average, and we can improve there. Let's hope that another COVID-19 doesn't hit. But it turns out that if you look at the government's response to COVID-19, New Mexico's was far more aggressive than any other state in the country. There's a separate paper by economists Vincent Miozzi and Ben Powell that looked at adjusted the economic freedom of North America to account for COVID restrictions, and New Mexico ends up on the bottom there. So, not overreacting to things like that, and to economists always like to say there's no solutions, only trade-offs. Appreciating that there is a major trade-off if you're going to very, very aggressively try to combat something like COVID. Recognize that can has trade-offs and has real costs when you're stopping people from earning a living.
Yeah, well, and it's not really covered in the report, but we are 5 years into COVID. Obviously, a vast majority of the restrictions have been released. We're no longer in a COVID emergency or anything like that, but the effects continue to linger. And one of the big areas of our economy that's not considered in this report, and it is an area of economic freedom, is of course school choice and educational freedom. And we don't have to belabor the point, but New Mexico may not be the least educationally free state in the country, but we're definitely challenged in our education results. And it's just as I say to people, it's tough to do everything bad when it comes to public policy, but New Mexico really does tend to overall do virtually every area bad when it comes to the economy, the education system, et cetera. It's just there are points of light, but there are way too many things that we do poorly here in New Mexico that make us unattractive for businesses and others to come to our state.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, well, I really appreciate your work on this, and I think it's going to really hopefully highlight some of the serious issues that New Mexico policymakers just um, have not gotten. And the fact that we are the only state in the nation over 20, no, what is it, close to 40, yeah, 40 years to have seen a decline in economic freedom. Interestingly enough, Michigan, Alaska, West Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, very odd smorgasbord of states there, just
Yeah.
a really unique group, have seen the most improvement in economic freedom. Interestingly enough, we're at the very bottom. Arizona, which I'd imagine was much more free to start with. Hawaii, which remains an economically unfree place. California, Maryland, mostly fairly blue, although Arizona being relatively unique. I don't know if they were just the Wild West of economic freedom back in the early 80s. Perhaps they were, but interesting that two former territorial partners there, once upon a time, Arizona and New Mexico, kind of towards the bottom. But New Mexico really does stick out with its decline in economic freedom.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, is that, if you're looking at levels and you're looking at changes. And essentially, it's easy to see a big improvement if you're starting at a relatively low level. So that's, a state like Michigan or Alaska or West Virginia. These are the states that have improved the most. They still are not really near the top in terms of economic freedom. But it's a real black mark if you are both at the bottom and you've lost. And New Mexico is really quite unique there. California is the only one that's comes close. And again, they haven't lost, but they're actually Hawaii as well. California and Hawaii have seen relatively little growth in economic freedom, and they remain near the bottom, just like New Mexico. But that's not only are things bad, but they're not moving in the right direction.
All right. Well, go ahead and make sure you go to the Rio Grande Foundation and Heirs of Enchantment websites to find economic freedom in the Land of Enchantment with Matt Mitchell and myself authoring. And we are going to take just about 5 or so minutes. I don't know. How long does it take to explain Canadian politics there, Matt? Uh, you work for, as I mentioned at the outset, the Fraser Institute, FRASER.org. They're a Canadian free market think tank. There's a lot going on right now in Canadian politics. Justin Trudeau riding off into the sunset as prime minister from the left wing Liberal Party, replaced. You'll have to help me with the name of the guy who did that. And they're going to have an election sometime soon. And the more conservative individual is Pierre Poilievre, maybe
Yeah.
pronounced Poliev. Yeah, sorry, my French is a little rusty. But can you give us a brief uh, understanding of some of the issues at play? Obviously, the tariff issue has loomed large, but when is the election? What is going on north of the border, and how might it impact American politics as well? In
Yeah.
5 minutes or so.
Sure. Well, and I'll say, I'm learning a lot of this too. I'm lifelong New Mexican and American, and now I've been working for this Canadian think tank for the last 3 years, and it's still quite a bit of nuance that I'm still trying to pick up on, to be honest. But yeah, so the basic story is, Trudeau had been the prime minister for about 9 years, and had just, in recent years, his popularity has really been plummeting across the Canadian spectrum. And there's various reasons for this. I think one of my colleagues put it pretty well. He said, essentially the Trudeau government combined an extreme arrogance, self-confidence, extreme, ideological commitment. They're very, very left, and with just general incompetence. And I think that general incompetence is the one, and maybe the arrogance as well, which has turned a lot of Canadian voters against them. So back in December, I think it was, the treasury, basically the head of the treasury quit, said she no longer wanted to be part of the government. And this kind of set into motion something that a lot of Canadians have been talking about for months, which was that Trudeau was going to have to step down. So he announced he was stepping down, and the way the system works is, then that triggered an election among the Labor, or I'm sorry, the Liberal Party. Now Mark Carney just won that election, and he is going to be the new prime minister. He is a he's a self-described global elite. He is, quite elite, been very involved with both US and Canadian businesses. He was the head of the Bank of Canada, as well as the Bank of England, or the UK bank. And so he, has this sort of background as an economist. And what's interesting is that up until very recently, Pierre Poilievre, the conservative member of parliament, has been had a giant lead over anybody that the Liberals picked, with presumed new prime minister. And that election, I think, will happen in the next few months. I think it needs to happen before June, as my understanding, but it'll happen relatively soon. And at this, it was expected that Poilievre was just going to run away with it. Then the Trump tariffs hit, and this was, for a lot of Canadians, this came from out of the blue. Trump ran on bringing back tariffs against China. He, ran on he's never been quiet about being a fan of tariffs, but applying them on the countries that he had, claimed was a very successful negotiation in his first term of the renegotiation of NAFTA, creating the USMCA. Economists, I think, would quibble with whether it was all that successful, but sort of didn't change too much, and what it did change was probably in a bad direction. But whatever, it was something that he had claimed was a good thing. Anyway, now, this really aggressive trade war against Canada. He just this morning he announced what he had earlier proposed as 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum is now up to 50%. This, most economists would say, a huge competitive advantage that both Canada and the United States have is this really integrated supply chain and this really open, limited barriers to exchange between the countries. He's really threatening that for both countries, and it's as the stock market's reaction has made evident, this is a huge problem. So anyway, this has single-handedly restored the fortunes of the Liberal Party in Canada, because Pierre Poilievre is seen by quite a few Canadians as being sort of Trump-like. He's not anti-trade, but he is, conservative and populist. And so this has, as Canadians have soured on Trump, they've also soured on what I conceive as somebody who's probably likely to push policy in a better direction. So it's kind of ironic. And apparently this is happening all around the world. I guess Trump's trade war is sort of souring similar candidates around the world.
Yeah, well, hopefully the Trump administration figures it out on tariffs. There's really never been a justification, even if you're arguing about kind of ancillary issues, illegal immigration, fentanyl, or whatever, not a serious problem coming across the Canadian border. But regardless, it's something that is going to harm that relationship and harm clearly the U.S. Economy. as well as the Canadian economy and ultimately Trump's administration if he doesn't relent. So that is taxes are always bad, including tariffs. And just because the Democrats are suddenly finding religion about tariffs doesn't mean they're totally wrong. They may be doing it for political reasons, but they're not wrong. And hopefully, Canadian and U.S. relations can be restored quickly, and we can keep those fights on the ice and those international hockey matches and leave it there. So anyway, well, anything else you want to share real briefly before we conclude here, Matt? This again, I just can't thank you enough for uh, doing this report and choosing to keep it right here in New Mexico, a state that has so many challenges and is so impacted by economic freedom,
Yeah,
lack
but
thereof.
two quick things, and they're kind of related. I'll try to relate them. One is bringing connecting tariffs with economic freedom. There is some research, and I just published an op-ed on this with McKinsey SMU. There is some research that shows that tariffs, barriers to trade, are sort of the leading indicator for future deteriorations in economic freedom. Those states, those countries that limit their citizens' ability to trade with foreigners, then later tend to limit their freedoms through higher regulations and higher taxes. And it kind of makes sense. Essentially, if you are opening up your country to trade, then you have to suddenly your businesses have to compete with other businesses around the world. You better make sure that they're not hobbled with other things like taxes and bad regulations. And so the opposite of that is true as well, is that if you are, once you start protecting businesses, then you can sort of afford to have other bad policies too. So there's that. And then the other thing just that I would generally mention for New Mexico is, you don't have to speculate. We don't have to go to a world where the only thing that we have to guide us is, Adam Smith. We can actually open our eyes, open our windows, look out at the real world, see what happens in places that are more economically free relative to places that are less economically free. And the evidence is quite clear that economic freedom is associated with greater prosperity. So, I would just encourage the policymakers in New Mexico to look at the actual evidence that's before them.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And look forward to seeing you hopefully at some events that we're going to do together and as well as at the upcoming event, which we get together and discuss economic freedom and these reports. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about with regard to sharing this report with our friends and colleagues in the other states. And of course, highlighting New Mexico's god awful performance on economic freedom. Always fun and frustrating at the same time to discuss. But thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.